So Sadie's not with us this time, and this is my third or maybe my fourth time going through the history. But oftentimes my focus is kind of on the logistics and the technology and all of that. And Sadie, I consider to be the real historian. So we will miss Sadie's firm history hand today. But hopefully we will muddle through. I am just going to briefly go over what we're going to do, and we have a 2-hour session from 4 to 6. We have a short reading, and if there's anybody who'd like to do that reading, it's Olympia Brown. I'd love to have a volunteer. We are going to spend a few minutes, and if we have a smaller group, some of these pieces, these discussion pieces, might move more quickly if a few people are absent today. But we're just gonna, it's halfway, so the opening sharing is really just, now that we're halfway, kind of what are there any big ahas for you, or any really big insights that have emerged for you? We will have an opening discussion about the content for this time, which is the missionaries and builders and the move across the frontier, and the stories from the South, some really, really amazing stories. So we will have an opening conversation about that. We'll take a little break. We will continue our conversation about the missionaries and builders. And if anybody's comfortable, just sort of taking a little bit of facilitation leadership, we would normally do breakout rooms for the going deeper, but I can't break myself into 2 places. So we'll see when that time comes. If we need to, if we only have 6 people, we're not going to do breakout rooms. And we will talk a little bit. So kind of moving into the South, there's some really interesting history and interesting stories that really relate to certainly to some of the African American stories, and some early Universalist ministers of African or Caribbean descent. So there's some really fun stories there. And there's a lot here about the kind of the move, the chasm that maybe still exists today between socioeconomic groups. So there was sort of the urban Northeast Boston versus the Universalist rural circuit riders and the Quill and Shin era. So there's a lot of interesting things to think about there in terms of what voices are marginalized in this part of our history. And then we'll do a short closing. So that's what we have for today, and I'm excited about it. I'm already recording. I started that, but what a great reminder, because I have forgotten. All right, so here we are. Did somebody else join us? I still see six boxes. So we'll see if anybody else comes in. But if you have a chalice and you want to, share in lighting a chalice, I invite you to do that. We'll just take a deep breath. There's Jansen. We will move into a reading. Is there somebody who would like to take a crack at the reading for us?
I can do it.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Let's see. Our opening reading is Stand by the Faith by Olympia Brown. Stand by this faith, work for it, and sacrifice for it. There is nothing in all the world so important as to be loyal to this faith which has placed before us the loftiest ideals, which has comforted us in sorrow, strengthened us for noble duty, and made the world beautiful.
There's more.
Do not demand immediate results, but rejoice that we are worthy to be entrusted with this great message, that you are strong enough to work for a great true principle without counting the cost. Go on finding ever new applications of these truths and new enjoyments of these truths and new enjoyments in their contemplation. Always trusting in the one God, whichever lives and loves.
All right. Thank you. Thanks, Michelle. All right. So, so we do want, hey, Jansen, welcome. We seem to have a smaller group today, so we're glad that you're here. So we're halfway. We're halfway through the reading, and we have marched forward through actually, quite a bit of chronological history. So it's just an opportunity to talk briefly about, are there any really big insights, either about your own understanding of Unitarian Universalist history or UU theology? Has anything emerged for you that is new and exciting?
May I go?
Yes, please.
I keep being surprised by how recognizable everything is. I feel like we're still living in these same moments. And on the one hand, that's wonderful because it gives me a real sense of continuity and history and relationship. And I can feel like I'm a one peg on that timeline. And on the other hand, I feel like, well, if we haven't solved some of these problems in 300 years, what are we doing wrong? Or do we just say these aren't problems that can be solved? Kind of like the big answer to who is God, what is God? Maybe that's just a question that's better asked as a question instead of trying to find an answer. Anyway, that's what I keep getting struck by.
Yeah.
Something that I thought was interesting that sort of bounces off what Courtney said was that I was having some of those similar feelings. A lot of them seemed like, a lot of the stories we're dealing with now, especially, maybe it's just a different gender or a different race and such. But when I was reading the story about Olympia Brown and the trying to get voting for women, and then at the end it talked about, okay, it's been like 80 years that they've been working towards this, and the people have been working towards this, and she gets the right to vote and is one of the first ones. And I think, and how much she had to do during all of that and keep fighting and such. And I find that especially around, right now we have a lot going on in our congregation around with like Black Lives Matter, and then, some division about, what happened in Dallas and such. And I just think, we've been dealing with these issues a long time too. But I mean, these people persisted for so long, but they finally got there. And, it took generations of people. And so it's just, a reminder that social justice is, sort of moves at the speed of church too. So.
Arc of the universe.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'd like to share.
Please.
So, reading about the regions outside of the East Coast was eye-opening. I think I tend to have this, Boston bias about what Unitarianism is, and to read about Jenkins Lloyd-Jones was really wonderful, and how he supported all those women ministers, and their focus on dealing with their everyday lives and social justice rather than theology was interesting.
Yeah.
And just, I think if Jenkins Lloyd-Jones was alive today, he'd probably be president of the UUA. I think he wouldn't miss a beat.
Mm, mm,
I think he's fascinating.
interesting. Yes. Yeah, you know, there's a lot of scholarship out there about kind of the theology of the West. And some of that scholarship actually relates to some of the evangelical practices, like the idea of a personal God. And there's some scholarship that says that that goes back to, you know, being out on the prairie or out on the, you know, in your wagon in this giant sky and no town and no city. And the only thing you had, which was typical for the time, the only book you had was the Bible. And that there, you know, this sort of evolved into this sense of God being a really personal, a personal companion to your journey. So it's lots of really interesting stuff. And we don't, you know, we don't necessarily, so where are people? Terry and Meredith, you're in the Midwest. Jennifer's in the Pacific Northwest. I think the rest of us are kind of in the Mid-Atlantic or Northeast. You know, we don't realize how there actually are some theological differences across the country, and even in Unitarian Universalism. So it's a wonder. It's no wonder we can't agree on things. So,
I found something interesting. I grew up in the Unity Church in New Thought Christianity and was very, very educated in that history. And I'm starting to see where they branched off in the transcendental movement because I know the history of Christian Science and Unity. And so to see that it's all beginning to come together.
mm-hmm.
And I can see that history crossing, and I'm at a much more familiar place where I'm like, I know this stuff.
Yeah.
I can relate that to what I already know instead of it all being new. And I loved the video. I love the idea of teaching history through theater.
Mm-hmm.
So I loved the video of Olympia Brown. That was my favorite by far.
Cool. Wonderful. Any other sharing?
I guess I'll share. It was great reading. It took me all over the place, and just trying to keep track of all the things I read and what stood out. Just all of the innovation, taking ministry into such people's lives in such new ways, and breaking boundaries with gender and race, and yet the old establishment kind of holding tight, and not allowing, having that resistance to that innovation, innovation of ideas, innovation of, women ministers and, their new ideas, just how that tension between them. And also it was good to learn more about the Universalists, because I feel like I've known a lot about the Unitarians, but not as much about the Universalists, and seeing the differences in polity and the missionary aspect of Universalism, that education, you didn't need to be educated to be a minister in the Universalist, which is very different from the Unitarians.
Some people
And,
want to return.
things started getting me thinking about my own nation's history.
Yeah. Cool. Good. Scarlett, we see that you have joined us. If there's anything you want to add, we're just doing kind of an opening conversation about big ahas. So feel free to jump in if you have anything to share. Anybody else?
Yeah, this is Meredith. And a couple of things. So as far as a big aha, I'm just realizing that kind of the depth of UU identity and the depth of spirituality that I've so often felt is missing. I didn't really have the language around it before, but I think, part of it is so many of the adults being come-inners who didn't have the decades and decades, or they didn't grow up knowing the history and haven't taken the time to learn it. And I think those who have taken the time to learn it, learning it later in life, learned it more academically than as like a narrative that really had a lot of meaning, like the stories I think of learning as a child. And then, so I'm just still processing that a lot, because I really want Unitarian Universalism to be deeply meaningful and nourishing for even just for myself, even, you know, I want to be part of a faith tradition that I don't feel like I need to go to someplace else. Like, there are so many people who, you know, are Buddhist and Unitarian Universalists, and I think that's in part because they aren't getting what they need in their congregation, and so they're seeking it elsewhere. And I feel like that myself, and so I'm trying to figure out how do we have the depth that, so we don't have to seek elsewhere. But then the other thing is related to the geography. I'm trying to square what I'm learning with my own experiences, and this idea that that Christianity in Unitarianism and Universalism was more in the Northeast, and that Midwest was more humanist historically. That was one of the very first things I learned in my intro to UU as a brand new UU. And then I thought at some point that I misunderstood because it was kind of the opposite of my personal experience.
Interesting.
Like last year I was working for a church in New Hampshire that had a very strong humanist tradition, stronger than any of the Midwestern churches I've worked with. And so I'm just, just trying to square what I'm learning with my personal experiences and figuring out why they don't seem to match up right clearly.
Wow. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, think more on that. Do some reflection on that, because that's an interesting observation. So, so we're going to take a look at the timeline, the interactive timeline, and just see who and what is happening in this time period. Let's see if I can find it, because I had it open, but now I'm not finding it. So that always seems to happen. Give me a moment. There it is. There we go. Hopefully you all can see this in a few seconds. Whoops, it's not at the beginning. So here's the beginning. What's interesting, some of the interesting things about this time are how prominent some of these names are sort of in our buildings and in our writing, and we may not know the history of some of these folks as closely as we might a Channing or an Emerson, but their names just seem to still sort of be alive in modern Unitarian Universalism. The Eliot family, starting with William Greenleaf Eliot, that says Greenleaf, but it's Greenleaf, and his wife Abigail. They moved to St. Louis, and there's a lot of association with churches and schools. There was a lot of connection in some of the stories from this time period of churches also being either community centers or schools or having some other kind of social purpose. And of course, the thread of abolition and the whole Civil War time is very strong in a number of these stories. We know that that was a key element of the story of Thomas Starr King, that he supposedly basically kept California in the Union, which gave them lots of money from the gold and resources, and may have won the war for the Union side. Women really figure, I think, somewhat more prominently, begin to really figure more prominently in this era, and certainly the work of Susan B. Anthony and all of the women who were connected with the first convention in Seneca Falls. Who was telling us about Seneca Falls? Who, is that Terry? Were you doing something with work around Seneca Falls, or, whoops, we lost Terry. There she is.
Not Seneca Falls. I live in Beacon, New York, and Margaret Fuller visited there. But I'm actually up in Rochester right now, so
Okay, you're up. So
the other end of things, visiting family.
Yeah, so there's a lot of connection there with. So you have the really a strong thread of social activism, certainly in the 19th and going into the 20th century. We were active in abolition. We were active in women's rights. And so it's a strong thread to this time. Lydia Jenkins was the first woman who was accepted as a preacher who was granted her office by a denominational authority. She won over male skeptics. Of course, winning over male skeptics did not mean that you were treated as an equal. It just meant that you were allowed to continue. And kind of one of the interesting backstories, and I'm not sure if this was part of your reading or not, is the Iowa Sisterhood, which is in this timeline. We know that many women accepted some of these frontier assignments because men wouldn't take them. And that's how they got there. And in fact, when they built communities, or maybe even churches were built and they began to thrive, guess what happened? Boston pulled those women preachers in some cases and replaced them with a more suitable educated male preacher. So it was one step forward and maybe a step or two back. If you had an opportunity, anybody have an opportunity to watch the Bisbee and Tuttle video? It's kind of long and it's a little scratchy, but it's actually really fascinating. There's a really interesting story about a couple of ministers who had a very public discourse about evolution, about religion and science and all of that. And so this was the time when there was a lot of public discourse around science and rational thinking versus other kinds of theological stories, theological narratives. So the publishing of Darwin's work was kind of a key milestone. Thomas Starr King was a New Englander who moved off to California and was actually really an important part, not only of he's an important part in our history, but he also had a really important place in the history of the state of California. And I think until just recently, you would go and there was a bust of him in our nation's capital because he was there somehow representing the history of California. So, of course, that was removed and replaced by someone not Unitarian or Universalist. But he was a really important player in this particular time. As I said before, the Civil War, keeping California in the Union a lot of that has been attributed to him. And the other interesting thing about Thomas Starr King, for me, has always been just being a little shocked at really how young he was when he died. He's a significant character, and he contributed a lot, and he was remarkably young when he passed away. So that's always a sort of something that you don't know when you read the bullets in history. Let's see if we can get back to the next one. Of course, the Civil War is a piece of American context that overlays a good part of the middle of the 19th century, and certainly with our work in the abolition work, and some of the interesting stuff that was happening with Southern congregations in the South, and the Southern congregations were not supportive of abolition, and in fact, I think in one of the readings it talked about how most of the legacy congregations in the South were all white, and there was not a strong presence certainly in the Unitarian congregations. In the Universalists, things began to shift a little bit, although the support was a little iffy. Because an important thread to some of this, as well as people marched to the West, was where the money was coming from, because there needed to be a patron. There needed to be somebody who could provide some support for ministers to physically make the move, for ministers to be able to have resources to build a congregation. And so the money was still being held for the Unitarians, certainly in New England. The purse strings were in Boston. And so there was a lot of tension between the desire to move west and the idea that much of the money was being actually raised and was physically held in New England. So there was a real strong tension there. Olivia Brown was ordained, and she has certainly occupied a pretty significant place in our stories, and particularly as we seek out some balance and some stories of others besides our white male characters in history. She has definitely had been a prominent part of the narrative. She wasn't the only one, but she was one of the first, and so that makes her important. And she was doing other things while she was ministering. She was raising children. She was also working on suffrage. So she certainly had, it's Ginger Rogers, she did it backwards and in heels. Their headquarters was established at 25 Beacon Street, our former historical, very historically connected Unitarian Universalist Association headquarters. We initially had a building, and I think that building was rebuilt. And if you actually many of you may have been to Beacon Street, but the number was 25, but that's not really the original building that was 25 Beacon Street. And so if you went to the one that the 21st century 25 Beacon Street, didn't line up with the other numbers on the street, because we demanded to keep the number 25 Beacon Street when the building was actually physically relocated. So an interesting tidbit about 25 Beacon. There was lots of stuff happening, and this is, I don't recall from the reading if there was much, how this played specifically into our Unitarian Universalist history. Maybe somebody else picked up something. This might have been a reading from when we had a little bit more, we had more readings. So does anybody remember the Indian Wars coming up in their reading?
Pat, the only thing I remember coming up about Native Americans in the readings was the part, just basically saying that this isn't covered very much because there's not a lot about, not a lot to be proud of.
Right. Yeah. And likewise, you know, with our history with African Americans, I mean, many of our ministers, of course, were slaveholders, and our southern congregations were not in favor of abolition, and even some of the Southern California, there was you know, some sides taken that would not be, you know, sort of match our progressive ideals of today. So some of the Elliots moved on out to Portland. And of course, Portland has been the center of Unitarian and Unitarian Universalism for quite some time. And Jennifer probably knows perhaps a little bit about this particular area or this particular history. But again, another interesting piece where the ladies, the women who were supporting these ministers were really significant in providing not only social networks and a lot of social activism and a lot of outreach, but also, in this case, even, you know, providing the means for financial support for a mission to take hold. So there was there are a lot of really unsung heroes, and I know that there are some women scholars, some women minister scholars who are actively working on trying to uncover more of that the history of the ministers' wives and the women who worked so hard for Unitarian Universalism. Mary Rice Livermore, she was a lecturer, writer, civic leader. She was really pretty amazing. She had a following, and she would speak, and thousands of people would show up. And she started as a Calvinist, and really had a conversion as a young adult to the ideal of rational thinking, and also, you know, she was an abolitionist and supporter of women's rights. So she was. She's. I mean, who'd ever heard of Mary Livermore before reading this? You know, she was a very popular lecturer, and I mean, and that's what people did in those days, lectures. So it's really interesting. The Universalists were gatherers, which is so interesting. That was a big part of sort of the Universalist culture, is that they had lots of gathering, and they created their first profession, and but they left out a clause that would have made it appear to be a more fixed or predetermined kind of creedal statement. So the Universalists are meeting. The Bisbees, I don't know if you had a chance, as I said, to watch that video. A really fascinating story about a debate and between two ministers, and it was riveting at the time. Apparently, I mean, it was quite a big story, and people. There was no TV, there was no cell phones with unlimited access to everything, all the knowledge in the world. So people were really, you know, they really got into these things. They really followed them closely. There was a depression that took place in 1873 to 1879. We need Deborah Eve to help us with some of that contextual history, or we need Sadie. Deacon Lloyd Jones, Jansen mentioned him. You know, he was really big. He was really big. He was a major figure really in the Western movement, centered mostly in the Midwest, because that's where the frontier was for part of this time. He is still, there's a Jenkin Lloyd Jones Press that is a publisher that is kind of affiliated with the Tulsa congregation. But if anybody, wonders why is a congregation in Tulsa, Oklahoma, why is that the largest congregation in all of Unitarian Universalism? And part of it is the legacy of the work of Jenkin Lloyd Jones and the strength of the Western Unitarian Convention. They really created an organization, and they built a narrative around the faith. Iowa Sisterhood, we've talked a little bit about that. There was a statement of faith that was things commonly believed among us, and I'm not sure if that came out in the reading, but that's really interesting to read. And if you go to the interactive timeline and click on that, it is interesting because, for me, I found it interesting because I was seeing some language that is like, wow, this language is so familiar. Where have I seen this before? Well, apparently this is where I had never seen it before, but this is where some of it came from. So it was interesting that some of those things are still with us. Joseph Jordan, who was an African American, he was ordained by the Universalists and worked in, there was a school and a mission in Norfolk, Virginia. And there's a lot of pain in this story. There's a lot of missed opportunity in this story. And I hope that you had an opportunity to read In Darkening the Doorways a little bit more detail about both the Norfolk and Suffolk missions. We just had a World Parliament of Religions in Utah, Salt Lake City, within the last year. And it was fabulous, and there were a lot of Unitarian Universalists present, and a lot of them involved in offering workshops and just being a part of the leadership of that event. And many people don't realize that we were, through the embodied by Jenkin Lloyd Jones, the person of Jenkin Lloyd Jones, we were really there at the very beginning of the Parliament of World Religions when it was created. And so there was our influence was definitely part of the initial Parliament. Pullman strike, financial panic, the Suffolk mission, which unbelievable that this mission really just sort of lasted into the latter part of the 20th century, that this actually went on. So Thomas Wives, he was associated with Joseph Jordan, and again, he didn't get the support. They wrote letter after letter to the fine folk up in Boston, and money was not forthcoming, and there just wasn't the kind of collegial support or financial support that they required to keep this a going enterprise. So again, another missed opportunity in our history, and we'll have a few minutes to talk about that. I think we're almost done here, I hope. This is a long one. Quillen Shin, he was, the original evangelist, and we'll hear about Quillen Shin. We'll talk a little bit about Quillen Shin. He visited basically every state in the Union. He went everywhere. Alaska, he was everywhere, and taking the message of universalism with him and empowering others. And his evangelism was also one of creating what some people might call disciples. So he really empowered leaders to take the message, to take the torch of the universalist message and share it. Athalia, Lizzie Johnson Irwin, a great story. I'm not sure if folks I think that's still part of our reading. But she was quite a character. and accomplished a lot against, I think, quite a few odds. And maybe we'll have a chance to chat about her a little bit more. She was, of course, in Little Rock, and that is where our interactive timeline ends. I think I'll take a deep breath. So there was just a lot going on. We were really reaching out into the world during this time, reaching out into the nation of America in many ways and in many forms. So let's move back and get to some questions here. All right. So I'm going to share my screen again. And all right, I've done all the talking for the last 15 minutes. So if you were going to write a story for Tapestry of Faith, and some of the Tapestry of Faith stories were part of our reading, whose story would you want to write? Hi, Deborah Eve. You've joined us. I'm so glad.
Well, I'll state the obvious. I think it would be Jenkins Lloyd Jones for me. It seemed like he, not only was he interested in the naturalism of Emerson and Darwinism, but he wasn't afraid of faith either. Some of the readings of his, or some of the writings, seem to indicate that he really had a balance between the truth of science, but also the mystery.
Mm, mm, mm. Great.
This is a tough question. Sorry.
Okay.
I think this is a really tricky question. And it would almost be interesting to write a story from the perspective of maybe a congregant at that time who's hearing new ideas for the first time, because the stories about the adults, especially if this is a tapestry of faith for young kids, the stories of the adults may seem almost out of their comprehension. That, you know, what it means to go west. I mean, this really seems to me to be a story of like Little House on the Prairie. I mean, it's kind of scary to think about how far they had to travel with so few resources and so few stops in between these prairie towns, these westward expansion towns. So I don't know. To me, this is a tricky one, and I think the best I could do would be maybe from someone hearing one of these people for the first time.
Mm. Great.
I think it would be interesting to explore more the Iowa sisterhood. I think that gives a lot of room for exploring different ideas and perspectives of many different people involved in that. I think that has a lot of potential for a lot of expansion.
Yeah, they were a hardy bunch. They were a hardy bunch, and they didn't get a lot of help from the people back in the cushy Boston. Any other responses here to this question, or just sort of just sharing some general sharing about a part of this, a piece of the timeline that you found particularly interesting or eye-opening?
I don't want to over talk.
Okay.
Okay. I really struck by that timeline and kind of this westward expansion idea of America developing at the same time as this new religion, and how integrated it seems to be. How you can't really separate the culture and the environment from the call to that religion. And I was just wondering how it developed in other areas. I know Europe, the Unitarians and the I don't even know if there is a Universalist in Europe.
It's pretty much uniquely American.
I mean, this and in these stories, these seem like very uniquely American stories too.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Mm-hmm.
I think the thing that I was thinking a lot about as I'm reading this, I've done a lot of local congregational history, and my congregation in the Hudson Valley dates back to the 1870s. It was founded, but it's got roots in the 1830s, actually. So I was able to see a lot of the themes, and my congregation was actually founded as a Universalists and Unitarians coming together. Unitarians kind of bought them out in a way, you know. Yeah, there was a Universalist congregation, and then the Unitarian congregation. Then they kind of joined together, but the Unitarians won over. And they have a lot of famous people. And there was also the Delanos, the grandparents of FDR, who were members. So Annie Delano Hitch was did a lot of there were a lot of similarities. She's like a character in my local history. Who was a woman who, founded things for the poor and organizations, and was a fighter. And so I saw a lot of similarities in kind of the strands and looking at, here's the national history and here's the local history, and how do they go together.
So Deborah, you shared in the group, in the chat box, what draws me to Unitarian Universalism is that in terms of world history, we are an emerging faith. And actually, I think that is the most important thing that we can offer, that fluidity. Institutional religion always is about power. To me, keeping that at the forefront is what is our only hope. As a student of American studies, yes, we don't really have separation of church and state, which is why people fled Europe. Yeah. Interesting. Did I miss any other comments? With that. All right. Any other general thoughts about this? We're going to have an opportunity to go a little bit deeper. Meredith, did you have? I see you turned your mic off.
Yeah, just as far as this particular question, I think Courtney's right that I feel really intimidated by the idea of writing a story. I think part of it is not knowing. I feel like I don't know enough yet, but also the things that I do know are pretty broad brushstrokes.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if I was going to do a story for all ages, or write a story for a curriculum, the details really make a big difference in people connecting with it. And I'm not sure how much that's even available. If we would have to do like creative nonfiction, which it's a stretch for me still. It's a growing edge to make up details about history in order to be able to share it well. So that's some of what's going on for me about this question.
Mm-hmm. Great. Okay. Well, we're going to take a break now, and we have a couple more sets of questions and then a closing. And we have a smaller group, so things are moving along fairly quickly. Are we good with a 5-minute break, or do we want to take a 10-minute break? 5. You want 10? It's okay. Looks like 5 is a winner. So I have 4:55. So I will return at 5:00, and we will take the next set of questions. All righty. Well, I'm back. Folks are coming back. We are going to move on to another set of questions. Where? Oops. All right. So, so here is where we're going to take it a little bit deeper. And there's a series of 3 questions. We don't have to do all the questions. You can respond to a question that that calls to you, or you can certainly, you won't be talking too much if you respond to more than one question. But I love the second question, and I hope that some of you will take a moment to think about that and share some of your thoughts on that. So based on what you know of your own congregation, how might it fit into the larger story? And of course, this is a fascinating question when we have folks from different places. And so the narrative, the context for their congregation is very different. So, and then, you know, sort of how did the experiences of those 3 significant places that were highlighted in this book, which I think is a wonderful book, The Missionaries, and if you did not have a chance to get that book, I recommend it, Missionaries, Builders, and Pathfinders. It was really, until this book came out, that was a little bit of an unexplored part of our history. So this has really been a very valuable resource. So how were those experiences different? You know, sort of what, and that, I think that takes us back to what Courtney was saying and Deborah Eve about, you know, sort of the integral connection between the larger context and what was happening in our American context and what was happening in our Unitarian and our Universalist congregations and story. And so how is this really still alive for us today? If Sadie were here, this is a time when we might break go into smaller breakout rooms so that we have a little bit more opportunity. Do folks feel like they want to do that at this time, or are we're a small enough group that we want to stick together?
I think
I'm
small.
okay. I'm fluid. I'm good. I'm flexible. All right. So take it away.
Okay. Because I'm feeling really chatty today. I'm really sorry. I'm doing the stepping up and not stepping back at all. Thank you.
Good. Okay.
You know, I'm watching like we all are, this divide in America over you know, the status quo, the white, you know, the white privilege, and I don't think I'm going to offend anybody on the call if I say that's the Trump vote, right? But it feels the same way as you know, the New England educated liberal upper classy groups still kind of having that impact on people, having that same reaction of people. It's like, hey, you don't get to look down on me. Sorry, that's my
Okay. Yeah.
but it's and the question of who is America and who are we as a nation. We're so many Americas, and I think on a micro level, we're so many Unitarian Universalists, and it's played out in small realms and in large realms, and the push and pull versus liberal thought versus give me one thing so that I can say here I am, I'm an American. It feels very relevant for today.
And reminds me of one of my favorite TED Talks, which is Chimamanda Ngozi, who does this Danger of a Single Story, and how we have created at some level a single narrative about our American history, and how some of these stories sort of are telling us something a little bit different.
I think the thing that I want to note to those questions about how these different regions were different, it seems that every region has its blind spots. Even those, it's easier to point the finger away from yourself at someone else. So the abolitionists up north, the Unitarians down south were not speaking out for abolition. They were and then where are the voices on Native American rights? They're missing from our history.
Yeah.
And that may be all around because people on the East were unaware or not or interested in other things, and people in the West were absorbed in it. I don't know what the reasons were, but and just those are just questions that. So all of these that are kind of swimming around that our history has both and. Our history has the abolitionists, and our history has those who did not speak out, and so it has for women, for African Americans, for Native Americans, and even my own congregation history. When I was doing it, it was founded by someone who got his money from the slave trade, from the Caribbean sugar trade, and yet the Underground Railroad passed through there, and I'm pretty certain one of the members was involved with the Underground Railroad. So a lot of unknown history there too, but I think debates and both ends could be existing even within my own congregation.
Yeah.
And they continue.
So I'll try and talk and see if I can do it because I've been coughing when I talk. But I'll try.
Dear.
So my perspective is having come from another country as an immigrant to the United States. I've lived here for a long time, and I'm South African. So I lived through a revolution, basically, that was about the very same thing that is such a big part of the United States. Like the two histories are very tied. When I look back and I look at our history as Unitarians and Universalists, I'm just always struck about how, when in hindsight, we are much more likely, just as human beings, to embrace innovators. But in a moment, it's really hard. And that's always the tension, right? That right now, I mean, honestly, if some of the people that we're studying about came to I'll represent the Midwest as a transplant, but if some of the people came to my congregation, they would be considered rude because you're not supposed to say what you think. You're supposed to be nice. The Midwest has that stereotype, and there's a reason for that because people like it and they perpetuate the stereotype on purpose. So it's not just a stereotype, it's people, it's culture that. So I don't know a ton about the roots of UUs today being in La Crosse, but I know they started out as Universalists. I know the first mayor of La Crosse was Jewish. I know that African Americans and Native Americans have always been part of the history here, as have women, and some of the women even that we read about who were in Wisconsin. And I find that fascinating because having come to live here and been here for 4 years, over and over and over, I hear more people saying that we are homogenous and not wanting to talk about the reality of what I see when I come to La Crosse, because every day I have this running list of how can I live here. Well, this week it's Liberace got his career going. Lacrosse was one of the places. And I keep saying somewhere deep down, there were people who went to watch Liberace perform in bars a long time ago in Lacrosse. So I'm always looking for that little seed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think we do it ourselves.
Yeah. A couple of comments in the chat box. Meredith says even some of the northern Unitarians weren't abolitionists because they owned cotton mills or had other financial or business incentives to continue slavery. And Jansen notes that members of the First Unitarian Church in Philly didn't want Reverend Furness to preach against slavery because they used southern cotton to produce goods. So yeah, so there were a lot of conflicting priorities in a number of places. I was struck by one of the stories about talking about some of the southern congregations and how it was more important for them to adhere to the social order where they were geographically. It was more important for them to maintain that than it was to speak out or to live perhaps their religious ideals that might be in conflict with the prevailing social order. So it's difficult. There's a lot of tension, and that takes me right to kind of Black Lives Matter and how that is, how response and action is very different in very different parts of the country.
Well, I don't know a lot about the history of our church here in Vancouver, but I'm taking a course over in Portland, Oregon on relationship with the environment. And so this past couple of weeks, we've been learning about the history of people of color in our town.
Mm.
And so it's very interesting to me because Portland, for me, I imagine is viewed as a very progressive place, a very liberal place.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not the history. That is not the history of it. People of color were not even allowed in our state. We were, pre-Civil War, when they were becoming part of the Union, they would pick a slave state and a free state, and they could both join. Oregon voted to be a free state simply so no people of color would be in it, period.
Mm.
And as late as the 1970s and 80s, people were bound to certain neighborhoods and not allowed to leave them. And so it's interesting to me, the First Church of Portland, I don't know a lot of history about, but I know it's been there a long time. So I'm curious to see how they lived in that environment, because I know it was not a very friendly liberal place at that time.
Mm. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, there's a lot of painful history there that, as you said, we think of Portland as being this kind of paragon of progressive thinking, and yet there's more to the story. Yeah.
I think what I have found interesting, and this is really just based on observations and things that I've seen. I don't know how. I don't know a whole lot about it, but when I was reading the readings and I was reading about the Western Unitarian Conference, and I thought it was interesting because it made me think back of when the UUA was going to move from 25 Beacon, and everybody was like all up in arms. And I remember reading some articles or seeing some comments and posts and such that the UUA should be located like somewhere in the middle of the country because it was too representative of like the New England history and past, and that it would better serve our denomination if it was more centrally located. And this reading brought that back up for me and made me think of that. And I realized that I have read all of this through the lens of someone who's always served congregations more easternly located. And it's interesting when I read the different geography to see that the experience of people in other parts of the country isn't the same experience that we sort of have here. And I think it's interesting to know, how true that is today. And I think that there is something to that. I mean, I've heard people talk about that, and so and say that just because of the actual location of the UUA, that it isn't always representative of. I don't know that moving to the middle of the country would solve that, but that has been popping up for me, and I thought it was really interesting, and especially reading about the Western Unitarian Conference and how it didn't seem like they wanted to have a whole lot to do with the AUA, and somebody at some point that might have been something different. Somebody actually gave money back to the Unitarians so that they could not be affiliated with them anymore. That might have been moving to a unity or something, but so that stood out for me.
Yeah. Great.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yay.
Yeah,
Good to hear you, Scarlett.
I've had a message the whole time that Zoom cannot detect anything.
You're here.
So
you're here
it's
now.
here. So I just wanted to share that I really liked that story. About Archer Alexander, which was really William Eliot, and I think it would be a great story at my church, just because it showed how they worked, within the system for good. That it worked out, working through the system instead of just, going ahead and letting the former, well, I guess he still was considered a slave in Missouri, instead of letting him, and not sending him back, but working within the system, how it did work out. Because I think that's a challenge, particularly where my congregation is. We're in a very sort of conservative area. Conservative, probably, I don't know, people that I don't live in Canandaigua, that's where my church is, and people kind of think they're just sort of a little better than everyone else there. And so I know for teens particularly, and the young adults, it's harder for them just being in there. And I think all the stories about the South and the Midwest and the West, and I was like, I need to pick and choose some of them to share in youth group and or maybe as stories with the whole congregation, how all of them, it seems like the women, the Sisters of Iowa, they were ministers and all, and then 20 years later it got taken away from them. Then they, all the males thought they had to be the ministers again, and so it was like we took 3 steps forward and 2 steps back, and that's just sort of the nature probably of change, is that you go as far as you can, step back, and then move forward again. So I really enjoyed that part of our history, and also just sharing. I think acknowledging, I think it helps me, and it would help others in the congregation, acknowledging that this is our history, and like we've realized reading it, like how come we didn't stand up for Native Americans? Like we are infallible. We're all here doing the best we can, but for various reasons, each of these people didn't stand up for everything. And our principles came about, and those are our sort of goals and guiding principles, but it doesn't mean that we hit them all on the nose every day or all the time.
Yeah, so true. Yeah, our record on Native American rights is a little thin, although there's lots of good work being done today. But back in that context of the Indian Wars, I think we were not so vocal.
On the third question about how UUism, which today is shaped by the events and people of these past readings, I wonder kind of if UUism would just be this. I mean, we're already kind of a tiny sect, but an even smaller sect. If I don't know, I don't know what the geographical breakdown is exactly, but my sense is that it's mostly New England congregations are fading away, and some of them are small congregations anyway, so it's not a lot of it's smaller churches being lost, but many of the larger churches and the churches that are thriving seem to be in the Midwest, South, and West. And so had it not been for all these seeds planted throughout the rest of the country, I think we really would be almost dead as a faith right now.
Yeah, and the data supports that observation that our overall numbers as a movement have been a little flat, but the growth that is happening, offset by declines in other areas, is happening mostly in the West. And part of that follows some of the growth of just shift in U.S. population, but I think it also reflects where our message is resonating.
I found it fascinating. I don't know if it was a couple of years ago. I don't know if it's still true, but it was like Texas was the fastest growing UU population.
Yes. Well, and Tulsa, Oklahoma is our largest landed congregation, brick and mortar congregation. So there's a really strong center there in central North Texas and Oklahoma.
As far as people who have the inclination to attend congregations on a regular basis, it seems like also I don't know, my sense of New England is of being fairly secular already. And so people aren't going to leave one congregation. I mean, that there aren't as many, whereas a lot of, in the Midwest and South, it seems people leave Christian congregations or temples or other religious groups to come to Unitarian Universalism. And so in that way, kind of those regional cultures, I think, support Unitarian Universalism being strong, whereas I see that less in New England and even the West. I don't understand really. I think of the West as being so liberal and like people not needing religion relative to Midwestern and Southern culture, and so I'm a little bit confused by the popularity of Unitarian Universalism in the West, actually, in California specifically, and the Pacific Northwest.
A friend of mine who's in our congregation absolutely does not believe in God, but is very, very active in our church, and they got here. They came to this denomination maybe 4 years ago, and she explains it that whereas a lot of people say they're spiritual but not religious, she says she's religious but not spiritual. And I wonder if that helps explain some. And it was amazing. I was like, how did I never think of that? We need community. Yeah.
Wow, interesting. So I just want to share Deborah Eve's post I keep thinking about how we need to talk about history as a process, not actual events, thinking about what it means to be a UU or what it means to be an American or what democracy is, means constantly being in process. As soon as any humans think they have figured something out, they stop thinking deeply. I'm thinking about telling these stories in a way that asks audiences to think about what they would have done. So it's not just about what happened, but how are we connected to keeping the story going? I do this sometimes when I retell a well-known story and try to tell it from a UU perspective. No royalty, no chopping off heads, no presuming gender. That's great. I love that that idea that asking audiences to think about a story, how to keep the story going. How are we connected to that larger narrative? What a great insight that is, Deborah Eve. I love that.
I've been thinking about the two congregations that I'm involved with, the one I work at and the one I grew up and belong in. And both of them are similar in that they started about the same time in the late 50s. And they started as humanist, or they were started by humanists. And they've had divergent paths. The church I grew up in, mainline Unitarian, has sort of moved into a more spiritual exploration. Maybe because it's bigger in this, so there are enough people that think that way to get some traction.
Jansen, you're popping in and out a little bit. Can you maybe move a little closer to the microphone?
Okay, I'll get closer.
Great.
Is that any better?
We'll see.
So the church where I work in Lehigh Valley is kind of stuck in their way they do religion, and it's sort of education based. When I was given adult RE duties, I found it very difficult to get anything going.
Mm-hmm.
And that's still the case. They have a educational program called Breakfast Forum that happens before church, and it's sort of lecture based unless the minister is running it. And it's educational. There's very little opportunities for faith development there.
Mm.
It's very interesting. And it's been frustrating for me and for the minister who would love to have people explore their faiths.
Mm. And I may have missed this. Is Lehigh Valley, is that historically Unitarian? Or it is?
I would say so, yeah. It's in terms of economic class,
Mm-hmm.
and it would be the same. Their ancestors definitely would have been Unitarians.
Okay. Great. Is there anybody who has not had a chance to share on one or more of these questions, or would like another bite at the apple? Or are we good? So we're going to move on, and this is our last set of discussion questions. Lifting up voices from the margins, and this is something that we haven't been good about doing necessarily over the years, really intentionally thinking about sort of what voices, who's missing from the conversation. I grew up Unitarian Universalist. I know that Jansen did, and several others, and I'm going to bet that you never heard the story of Joseph Jordan or Thomas Wise when you were a kid. And so, how does that happen? How does that narrative get shaped? So what response do you have to the stories of those who were on the margins of the denomination and either the Unitarian or the Universalist due to race, gender, social class, and geography? And what does this tell us about our heritage, positive or negative? And I know we've already touched on some of this, but we'll take a few minutes just to really focus intentionally on this piece of marginalized voices.
Well, connecting these stories with present day, the ministers meet for a few days before General Assembly, and it's called Ministry Days. And as a seminarian, I was there this year, and the beginning keynote speaker was the president of the United Church of Christ. And he's had a couple of really interesting things that he kind of charged us with. And he basically said that Unitarian Universalists are in a really, just our theology makes us like incredibly fitting with what's going on culturally right now. And so we could be kind of evangelizing and possibly having a boom right now. But he also said that one of the things that he thinks is holding us back and that we're going to have to let go of is how our ministers are trained. And so that they go to seminary and that they do an internship and that there's a set of requirements and it's all very prescribed, and it really puts a financial burden on the individuals, and it's very difficult to do if you are the head of a household. So just while an amazing number of people make it work who come from marginalized groups, it's definitely more difficult for people from those groups to become Unitarian Universalist ministers right now. And so that's just something that I think is really important for us to deal with.
Mm-hmm.
Meredith, can I ask a follow-up question?
Yeah.
In seminary, as they are training UU ministers, do they talk at all about missionary work and evangelical outreach?
Yeah, so the seminary I'm going to is a United Church of Christ seminary, so I'm not sure what it's like at Meadville Lombard or at Star King, but among ministers and seminarians, evangelism is a pretty big topic and has been for the last few years. So trying to get people out of this mindset of like that any evangelism would be pushing our beliefs on somebody. Like just, it's okay to go out and talk to people about what our beliefs are.
Mm-hmm.
So, but how to do that well, and I think too, I'm at the Midwest Youth Leadership School right now, and so we've been talking about Myers-Briggs types, and I'm pretty sure that it's a high percentage of UU ministers are introverts, and I don't know if that's true for UUs at large too, but I just wonder how much of just if we're kind of an introverted, I wonder if we're an introverted faith basically, and if that is like if that's a growing edge for many of us just because of our personality types.
And we certainly saw that in some of those stories of the founders. I won't get us off track, but you know, all these kind of quirky isolationist hermits.
Yeah.
we come from introvert stock.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. We have a couple comments in the chat box. Oh my goodness. Let me share here. So Michelle said, going back to the last set of questions, she said the second question makes her realize that she really needs to look into the history of her congregation more deeply. And that is a really fun thing to do. To really think about, what's the DNA of my congregation, and what was happening, in the larger story at that time. So that is actually really fun work to do, I think. And some congregations have that. They take a lot of pride in their own story, and there are many congregations where they've got a little published book, a pamphlet about their own history. And Scarlett says, conversely, her church is less than 20 years old, and she knows its history. Does that mean you've been there for all the history? Pretty much. But it's interesting to look at history of nearby churches, because they are in what has been affectionately called the burned over district in New York State. Yeah. So do you want to say a little bit more about what the burned over district is, or why we use that terminology, Scarlett? See if she can unmute. There you go. Nope, we can't hear you. You're unmuted, but we're not hearing you.
Okay, how about now?
Yeah.
Ah, right. Okay, so just the burned over district, there are always churches or libraries or the universities, the private universities, having seminars and things on it. So they called it the burned over district because all kinds of different religions from different poles just spread across, as the Erie Canal was created, just zoomed across New York State, from spiritualists, the sisters who could talk to the dead, all the Christian religions, the Unitarian Universalism. I was trying to think. All the Shakers were up at the lake, and then the female incarnation, I remember that one. I can't remember that woman's name. Was just about an hour and a half south of here, and she had a following. So it was just this crazy time when the Erie Canal opened up that all these things just developed really quickly. I mean, that's a really brief history.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. We're just looking for the flavor. So that's a good one. And Deborah Eve says, I'm thinking a great youth project would be for youth to do some basic cultural archaeology in our congregations. Yeah, do some basic visual description of who is in our posters and quotes, and how our surroundings compare to other cultural spaces in the U.S., what we sound like. Not to say we have to be similar, just how we see and hear ourselves. Oops. And not just how we think we are or what our beliefs are, what our physical buildings say about us. That is a great topic. I went to a great workshop with a minister named Alice Mann, who's, I don't know if she's Methodist, Presbyterian. Anyway, she's written a lot of stuff around church growth, but talking about the soul of the institution and how important it is to think about the sacred space and how much that is a part of our congregation's culture, and we really need to discover it and to make it a part of our larger narrative. What our physical buildings say, there's a great book, Motel of the Mysteries, where cultural artifacts in a motel are interpreted hundreds of years from now. Oh my God, that sounds great. I'm an academic, so I'm totally about thinking and writing, but not all people process information that way. The thing about being introverts is that if we have a culture controlled by introverts, we think that everyone else is loud and too outgoing. Indeed. How interesting. So thank you for that comment. That's a good one. Okay, anything others on this? This is really our last set of questions. So we have plenty of time if there's folks who haven't shared yet, or
just, I guess, going back to, voices on the margins and looking at those examples in the South of those two African American ministers. First of all, the fact that both the first Black minister and the first female minister came from the Universalists kind of goes in line with the way that we ordain and the differences between the Universalists and the Unitarians, and what was being said before about our current system went with the Unitarians, really, and that, for the Harvard elite education, seminary route, and the Universalists, it seemed, coming from the missionaries and, reaching out to everyone, living, the ideal of all are ordained. And there was a lot of lay ministry, it sounded like, going on as well.
Mm-hmm.
Some people like Mary Livermore, and others were not ministers, or lay ministers, lay people doing ministry. And just also the way that there's a lot of emphasis on, in both the Unitarians and the Universalists in these examples, of going beyond the Sunday service and going into the neighborhoods and into the communities. And one of the questions that was raised to me is why that didn't get institutionalized in a way into beyond, like the urban ministry continues in part of an institution, but they were very innovative and very focused outward. So just thoughts about what we can learn from the past, the successes, the things that were working, and then also the things that didn't, the ways that they were not funded and supported. And
yeah. And I think at least the readings seem to point us to the idea that particularly in the Midwest, there was that flavor of connecting the faith community with a community social action or community social work in the community. And that was a really important part of how those congregations, part of how they developed their identity, and how they grew a following, how they grew the faith in those areas, was through the housing the homeless, or building the Abraham Lincoln Center, which remains in some form today. Those kinds of things there seemed to be a real pocket of that in the Midwest. So, great. Any other closing thoughts? Was this a good set of readings for you all? I mean, did this? I know sometimes we know what we feel like we know kind of the bones of, Faustus Socinus and Michael Servetus, and I know the first time I kind of read this particular set of readings, I was like, whoa, this is just all so new for me. It was like a discovery, a moment of discovery for me. Anybody else have that sense? This is not part of the mainstream of our UU history.
I thought it was hard to keep all the names straight, but I'm glad that all the stories were there.
Yeah,
I was really glad that of the way that they presented the marginalized folks as having that these are missed opportunities, instead of trying to cram it into cram a square peg into a round hole of history. The way they frame it as missed opportunities, I really that was very meaningful for me.
And how does that translate? Where are the missed opportunities around us? We won't know, but they're there. So, yeah.
I feel like our congregation is missing all kinds of opportunities. Demographically, we could, the Lehigh Valley could support a congregation the size of 700 members, and we have 200, and very few new people join, and very few young people join. I've actually closed the nursery because it's not used. And I have this kind of chuckle when I hear them proclaim their diversity.
Mm.
It's so little diversity. Of course, I'm fit right in with that.
Yeah.
And I think when people come to visit, they enjoy the preaching, and they have children. The children enjoy their experience, but it's really hard to work their way in socially.
Mm-hmm.
People at coffee hour are in closed conversations, either doing business or just being exclusive. And everybody wants to make the congregation bigger, but they just don't know how. They don't know what they're doing that's preventing that, or how they are being.
Mm. Mm. Thanks, Jansen.
Am I on?
Yes.
Yay! Jason, that just made me think, just sometimes it's hard for us to sort of step outside and look at ourselves, look at our congregation or our different rituals, from parking lot stuff to, like you said, coffee hour, to what we do. And I know we have that same issue at the church I'm at, my church, Canandaigua, but also another church that I worked as interim DRE for. And it made me chuckle because just because of I didn't have my textbooks ordered as early as I wanted to, and I know the First Universalist Church in Rochester has a wonderful library from when I worked there, and so I asked them, I emailed and asked them if they had these books, because I had a feeling they might have them, or some of them, so I could start reading. And they did, but they couldn't lend them to me because I didn't have a name tag. I do have a name tag, just not from their church. I do have a UU name tag, which I told them. And I'm like, and I was at your church for, a year or so,
Wow.
working there, and I'm a member of another church. I mean, there seems like there could have been an alternative, like I can leave you a check for the cost of the books, the replacement costs, in case I don't return them. But there wasn't any flexibility that they could lend me these books until mine arrived. So I think that's part of it. Somehow we get sort of fixed in our ways, and we don't take a look and see what it looks like to the people on the outside.
Yeah. Hmm. Wow.
If I could add something, we rent our social halls to Hispanic community members because we're affordable. We're right there. We allow beer and wine. I don't think it would even occur to anybody to work with the Hispanic community on some social justice project.
Hmm.
It just wouldn't occur to him.
Hmm. And so maybe some of these stories that we're hearing about what's going on in our congregations now, it's possible that this is a repeating of patterns that the seeds of which were planted, very early in our story, and we continue to perpetuate those stories, and it's hard to break out of them, as Scarlett was saying. Really hard to change your narrative. So I see we have a couple questions on the chat. Michelle agreed with my comment about, sort of these readings felt like sort of a whole new world. And Deborah Eve says, when it comes to U.S. class and culture, music is huge. For newcomers, our music can seem really archaic. My rule of thumb is if the same people in a congregation like anything the same way, they are creating a dominant culture. I feel successful as a DRE if different people tell me they liked something. Our principles can guide us. We have to keep the web dynamic. We can have hymns, but not 100% of the time. Well, amen. Our principles can guide us. So, Any last thoughts, or shall we rest with Deborah Eves' comment? So we have some closing words. We'll end a few minutes early today. It's a smaller class, so that is a good thing. Is there somebody who would like to? Oh, we got some comments here. Check those first. Everybody's ready to rest. No rest for heretics. Thank you. Is there somebody who would like to take a crack at our closing words? They are the words are from. You probably want to know who wrote those words.
I can read it.
That would be wonderful. I would tell you who wrote those words in a second. Go ahead. It's actually 3 screens, so I will move it as you read.
Okay. It sounds along the ages, soul answering to soul. It kindles on the pages of every Bible scroll. The psalmist heard and sang it, from martyr lips it broke, and prophet tongues outrang it till sleeping nations woke. From Sinai's cliffs it echoes, it breathed from Buddha's tree, it charmed in Athens' market, it hallowed Galilee. The hammer stroke of Luther, the pilgrim's seaside prayer, the oracles of concord one holy word declare. It calls, and lo, new justice. It speaks, and lo, new truth. In ever nobler stature and unexhausted youth. Forever on resounding and knowing not of time, our laws but catch the music of its eternal chime.
Wonderful. Thank you. And that's actually the words to hymn from our hymnal number 187, which captures the spirit of the Western Unitarians. So we end with the spirit of those who marched west and took our Unitarian and Universalist ideals with them. So thank you all for your time today, and we will see you on the forum, and we will see you on July 28th.
Thank you, Pat.
Enjoy the rest of the summer. Take care.